Thank you. You began us yesterday with a reflection on friendship and home. And towards the end of this very short presentation, I want to pick up on the way in which you started us all so helpfully. My task is to reflect as we have been thinking together over 3 sessions thus far on particularly the multi-religious elements of a shared ethical commitment to sustainable development. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to build on that conversation. It'll continue as we go across our sessions. Religions for refugees, moral foundations for common action. I'll try to address that briefly for us, and then to even indicate that the moral is supported by our deepest respective spiritualities as well. Refugees and we could say the rupture of the integral ecology of Laudato Si. Many noted that yesterday, that would be one way to try to understand the refugee situation. Laudato Si's integral ecology, in the language of our last meeting, is an image of positive peace. It's not simply pointing us to what's gone wrong, it's pointing us to where we need to go. It calls for us to advance the good as much as resist what is distorted or evil. It's a flourishing based upon, as we've all noted, the proper ordering of persons with one another, with creation, and finally with God, or the ground of the mystery that each of our religions know. If refugees are a manifestation in their personal suffering of the rupture of integral ecology or of sustainable development, Jeff, you pointed us yesterday to the distinction between fundamental drivers, war, economy of exclusion, environmental degradation, more proximate manifestations or drivers, large flows with inadequate practical and political mechanisms. Our leading presentation yesterday morning was absolutely elegant in that regard. And then competing notions of the good society. Finland was contrasted with an aggregate of individuals. And it's in that context that we're struggling to understand Laudato Si as an expression of integral ecology and the positive good that calls us to, and also an understanding of refugees as its rupture. I think my job is to note that there is an emerging interreligious expression of integral ecology. Each religion, all the religions in this room, represented in this room, have their own analog of an integral ecology. Muslims have, Hindus have, Buddhists have, Jews have, and other religions that are not in the room with us at this moment. And they include, for each of them, their understanding of human dignity and communal flourishing, their understanding of the moral exigence for harmony with all of reality, with nature, and their understanding of ultimate fulfillment or realization of persons and communities. Now, out of that wealth, there's the emergent multi-religious expression of integral ecology, and religious leaders have used, and they could use others, but they have begun to speak of it, at least in the circles that I'm privileged to work with, as shared well-being. A positive image of shared well-being. And it emphasizes, again, like Laudato Si, the obligation to promote the good as well as to address what thwarts the good, the reciprocal link between unfolding human dignity and advancing the common good, and appropriately in the interreligious context, some modesty regarding the religiously specific notion of ultimate fulfillment. Catholics might speak of the beatific vision, Other traditions might speak of supreme enlightenment. And so we have to be modest with each other in that language and allow each community to honor their own experience. As we had yesterday with you, Father Michael, and your colleague, Father Baggio, just in a way that's remarkable, shared well-being, this interreligious attempt for an integral ecology, is based on shared moral principles, and they are, in their own way, the same four that have been identified in Father Baggio's very concise statement. They're naturally nested in each of the religion's own particular constellation of symbols and language. But we can find them. Human dignity rooted in their experience of transcendence. Again, the common good linked to the unfolding of human dignity. Solidarity, all are to care for all, from the individual to the most complex institution, within the religious communities, but within society at large. And I think we can just simply refer back to Father Baggio's excellent statement, and each religion would sketch for itself its own particular expression of these same basic principles. I think, borrowing a term from Clifford Geertz, I think we have to ask ourselves, is this interreligious moral consensus a very thin consensus? Or is it moving from an understandably early light consensus to what we could call a thicker consensus? And I'm happy to report that there is obvious progression and movement towards an ever richer, ever thicker consensus on these shared principles. And there are, if you will, drivers of this emerging consensus, this growing thickness of the multi-religious consensus. And it's a thickness that never veers into what we call syncretism, a sort of lazy way of saying all religions are the same. Rather, it dives into the very depth, particular experience, and out of that finds an emergent, thicker and thicker consensus of these four principles. The drivers of this, I think, remarkable thickening of our moral consensus is that each religious heritage today is challenged to re-express itself, rehear itself, and then re-express itself in relationship to contemporary common problems. The problems of sustainable development are not Buddhist problems, or Hindu, or Islamic problems, or Jewish, or Christian. They're everybody's problems, and so all of our traditions are trying to rehear themselves vis-a-vis the lenses of those problems and reach within their usable paths to honestly re-articulate who they are in this moment of time in terms of their care. And so we're constellated around common challenges, and we're speaking to each other about what's in our treasury of heritage that's relevant to being aligned around these problems. In that remarkable way in which the religious communities are putting problems at the center of the table, they're discovering what we could call the complementarity of their gifts. What do Muslims have to help all of us? What do Buddhists have to help all of us? In terms of their virtues, their deepest virtues, in terms of their moral memories, in terms of their institutions across continents, and similarly for all. And so you find the religious communities discovering one another as profound allies, united in solidarity on a moral challenge, and yet that union and solidarity is not suppressing differences. It's driving us into an ever greater refinement of understanding each other. This is being done by what I have termed the emergence of a kind of religious bilingualism. We think of the Pope with Laudato Si. He's addressing, of course, Catholic Christians, But he's not solely, in a restricted way, addressing them. He's appealing to all people of goodwill, and therefore speaks a language of moral care, rooted in his faith, surely, but addressing men and women of conscience around the world. Increasingly, all of our religious communities, Jews don't just talk to Jews. They talk in the public square, and that's true of Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and all, and they're learning to both retain their own primary religious language and at the same time collaborate through a second idiom, a public language that they're further building together. And finally, we are in the midst of something that has a very elegant way of speaking, but is really quite remarkable in our own age. And I use the term mutual self-mediation. Our communities are, in a sense, helping each of them to re-express themselves. I think of, Rabbi Rick, of the misunderstandings and disagreements at the birth of the Christian movement in terms of Judaism. Those misunderstandings and those ways of possibly injuring each other were potentially driving each community further away from one another. Today, we see generosity evoking generosity from one community to the other. And this is happening among the world's religions at large. The good calls forth the good. And so if there is the possibility of a mutual self-mediation that is estrangement one from the other, the inverse is true, and we're witnessing it today. So for all of these reasons, I think that the interreligious moral consensus is moving relentlessly from thin to an ever thicker and more nuanced congruence, even as the specific identities of the religions are being retained. This may sound like abstract, but it is actually a stunning development in our own day, that religions are authentically being themselves and relating one to the other. Now, if there are principles, it's a new point, if there are principles for shared, profound principles, principles by themselves, moral principles, are simply inadequate in terms of making moral judgments. And therefore, principles need to be matched with something that in one tradition is called prudence. And it's a particular virtue of practical decision-making that allows one to adjust principles to a local context, make a wise decision. So prudential judgments, if we thought about yesterday and the rather remarkable exposition of the drivers of the refugee crisis, there's no one act that's going to redress that. Prudential, wise decisions have to be made from the most local to the most global. And those principles will not be guiding principles without something called prudence. So I think the teaching of the religious communities is that only morally wise subjects and morally wise communities can make morally wise judgments. Here's the point. You could have all the data in the world, but an analysis of that data is not the same as making a moral judgment. Fact and value are quite distinct, and moral judgments would be made by cultivating the relevant virtues to make value judgments. That's an area where the religious communities have over time developed extraordinary inner attention. I'm going to use this as one example of a Christian community. Prudence was understood, the ability to make a judgment on the good, as relying on four virtues that had to be cultivated. The virtue of wisdom, which needed to be joined with a habit of seeking justice, a complete commitment to justice, supplemented by fortitude or courage. One is being buffeted by counterclaims, and by temperance, that one would be balanced. And the understanding, and this is drawing from the Aristotelian tradition, was that those four virtues would be required in order to make a moral decision. But if that prudence was deep and truly in touch with the relevant data, the moral decision that would be made would be both personal in the most intimate sense, but public in the sense that it would have truth. It would disclose what would be compelling for us in the ethical domain. Some version of that is present in Islam, in Judaism, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, this enormous cultivation of persons and communities to be moral agents, capable of prudential judgments, value judgments. Now, in the religious communities, that's not all that they bring. And what we're committed to as religious believers is not narrowing down our own religious heritages, but bringing them to each other with modesty, but true conviction. Again, but I'll illustrate this with Buddhism, just as an additional example. In one stream of the Christian tradition, these cardinal virtues of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, which would be essential to make a genuine moral choice, are complemented by what are called theological virtues. Now, let me just share that a virtue is always understood in relation to its object. So wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance were virtues you cultivated in order to be able to make a decision about the good. What's the right choice? What's the right thing to be doing? And the understanding in the heritage that this reflects was that those virtues are complemented by another set of virtues, so-called theological virtues. But the object of those virtues is the transcendent God. And in that sense, God would be the source of faith. God would be the very source of hope and the source of love. And the elegance that's reflected in Bishop Sarando's room here is that there was an enormous confidence that those theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, would not warp or distort or suppress the intellect, but would heal, strengthen, and in a certain genuine way reposition the intellect in terms of a wider horizon of the mystery of God's love. And that is a very deep achievement, I would suggest, of the religious heritages, and this could be illustrated by a completely different tradition. Buddhists, for example, are all about the state of infinite, unrestricted compassion. And if you interrogate Buddhists, they're utterly clear that it is the eternal Buddha that forms within the human being themselves the awakening to that infinite compassion. That awakening to infinite compassion would reorder all the ordinary virtues within the Buddhist community, all the ordinary values within the Buddhist community. So in a way very analogous to what I've described within an Aristotelian borrowing or using within Christianity. Islam has had its own versions of this, Judaism has had its version, Hinduism and Buddhism, others, as I've mentioned. It's important because we are convinced that religions will contribute most by being religious, that is the great strength they will bring as partners as we work with sustainable development. If all of this, what I've done to date, is the last few slides, is talking about the cultivation of subjects and communities as moral agents through virtues, ordinary virtues, we could call them, but those virtues that are very expressly religious, there's yet another, I think, dimension to the religious contribution to the coalition of all of us trying to advance sustainable development. Yesterday, former President Prodi And those of us who were close to him to watch his face as he spoke, you saw a remarkably wise, experienced, deeply moral man muse on how difficult this situation is, dark clouds. And then he and others used the word hope. And hope, of course, is not plural. It's not hopes. And I think the religious communities understand hope in an extraordinarily concrete fashion. And let me use it with a theistic metaphor, but it could be applied to Buddhism or other different theistic traditions in their own ways. It's as if the religious communities have soberly come to the conviction that God does not suppress evil, but that God would transform evil with human collaboration. That humans could collaborate with God so that the problem of evil, which is a problem that vexes our efforts for justice, could find a way to be solved. And the grammar or the algebra of that collaboration is oddly innocent suffering. It's not idealism at all. It's not pretending that the world isn't in serious trouble. It's opening our hearts to how serious it is. And it's the Jewish profound understanding of tikkun olam, that Jews would walk into the face of that suffering and bear it and help to heal it. It's the Christian law of the cross, that the Christians understand themselves as mystically united in what they call the body of Christ. But that is to bear with Jesus his own self-sacrificing love and bearing innocently suffering. It's Islam's own understanding of that, of repelling evil with good. It's beyond the ordinary calculus of justice. It's transforming enmity into devoted friendship. It's Hinduism's, and Gandhi was centered on this. It's Hinduism's question of who is the worshiper, and answering it's the one who takes on the sufferings of others. It's the Buddhist bodhisattva way, that the way to realize what it means to be a human being is self-emptying compassion for the other's suffering. So these are limit languages that are at the hearts of the religions. They are anything but a lack of commitment to justice. They're the sober recognition that justice is on the way, but as it's on the way, there's a way to participate in a transformation of what hurts us so deeply as human beings. I come back to you, Archbishop Sorondo, when you spoke of friendship and you spoke of home. This is a Jewish family in Germany whose relatives were lost in the Holocaust, celebrating a meal with Muslims. And they're just being Jews. They're just being what it means to be Jewish, and they know that. And they are in midst of those difficulties in a kind of joy to do that. This is an Islamic woman embracing a Christian child. And if you will, she's just being Islamic. And she knows in her religion the joy of that possibility. And this is a Sikh, a few miles from the Syrian border. That's a Sikh kitchen behind him. Tens of thousands of meals have been produced by the Sikh community, although there are no Sikhs in Syria. But Sikhs understand their own version of what all the traditions understand, that as they quest for justice, they also are invited into bearing the other's burdens. And I would submit that is quintessentially the gift of our religions, even if they have their own ways to cultivate virtue, and that's essential to moral decision-making. Thank you very much.